Hello everyone, welcome to week 3. This is the introduction video. So this week we are going to be covering chapter 4. This is going to cover the topics of the peopling of the world. And these are events or processes that led to basically every corner of the world being inhabited by humans. So some things to pay attention to. We're going to start off looking at the peopling of Australia. Then we'll move to the Americas and then the Pacific Islands in terms of events and processes that we're going to look at within the archaeological record. We will see the daring habitation of early Australians crossing Wallenius and look at the remains that they left behind that tell of their hunting practices and just how archaeologists interpret the role humans played in the extinction of megafauna species by as early as 44,000 years ago, which is much earlier than what we see in the Americas. From here, we will move to the peopling of the Americas and discuss multiple waves of migrations. We will talk about the Beringia land bridge and the climatic reasons behind a lot of the mobility that resulted in the peopling of the Americas in specific processes. For example, the opening of ice sheets in Canada. We also talk about coastal routes that contributed to peopling events even earlier in America. As an example, we will read about Middlecroft Rock Shelter, which is in what we now call Pennsylvania, and Monte Verde in South America. And through this, we will be introduced to the typologies of Clovis and pre-Clovis, which have particular meanings in terms of time, location, material culture, hunting practices of these separate groups of people in the Americas that eventually merged over time. We will briefly touch on the topic of methodology after this, but in particular the justification for ever performing an archaeological method. So we're going to be moving into archaeological ethics, and we'll review the case of Kennewick Man. And we'll see how NAGPRA, which is the Native American Graves Protections and Repatriation Act, how it emerges out of the National Historic Preservation Act of 1966. And really it was the continuous pressure from indigenous groups calling for repatriations for burials of indigenous human remains that are excavated by archaeologists. This is what catalyzes these reactions from the federal government in order to re-systematize legally archaeological practices. But still to this day, we see discrepancies emerge over these topics. It hasn't quite gotten rid of it. This has put recent pressure on archaeologists to reorient their work together with the communities who are ethnically and culturally connected to the land and remains that archaeologists work with. So from here, we will move to the peopling of the Pacific Islands, which is, in my opinion, one of the most skillfully executed migration processes in the existence of our species, and it occurred over a series of hundreds and thousands of years, peppering related but distinct societies all throughout the region. We will read about some of the early interactions with Europeans that shed light on this process in very detailed ways and written into the history books. In a way, archaeologists have been trying to answer a lot of the same of the curiosities that early Europeans had when they first came in contact with people from the Pacific. And much of that fascination is around how and why they arrived in the first place, and what happened after peopling events changed the environments of the island and even the human societies themselves. From here, we will get a glimpse into the worldview of Pacific Island cultures as we take on an awareness that the stories that we tell to each other about the past are vital in knowing who we are and knowing how to practice that knowledge. From here, the chapter will finish up with a discussion on what an archaeological survey means conceptually and what it includes methodologically, and how different pieces of information are all useful at pinpointing the locations to investigate to answer specific problems. We will consider what this includes in the Pacific and the Arabian Peninsula contexts. This is always what archaeologists would consider the prep work for specific scientific testings that they aim to employ, and it can become a very rigorous and long process. Sometimes the classical idea of archaeological investigation, namely excavation, takes much less time than the process that helps the researcher know where they are excavating at and why. This helps us avoid any unchecked desire to just stick a hole in the ground anywhere and see what you can find. So the peopling of vast continents is a classic topic in archaeology. It's constantly receiving revisions and is truly always open for debates in terms of the details and nuances of these events. Last semester, there was a decent portion of the final posters that were on early sites in places like the Americas. It remains an ever-present topic of allure for archaeologists. So many archaeologists would be elated to find the oldest and earliest evidence of human beings in a location, or the evidence that really helps us understand how they got there and what happened when they arrived. How did the environment change? Did they transform the landscape immediately? Did they flourish, or did they perish, and why? These sorts of questions are things that we will be talking about this week. So with that, I will move on to the assignment reminder. So we only have 2 assignments really this week. The first is the discussion 3. So again, this has 3 parts, but this discussion will allow us to think more in a political economy perspective, if you will, when we consider archaeological ethics and who has what say and why things play out the way they do. So here we are concerned with various stakeholders who are connected to the practice of archaeology, either by working in it, funding it, or being culturally or inherently connected to the material they are responsible for. We will refer to the textbook example that comes from Australia, and we will also watch a short video on the destruction of sacred sites. And we will consider some of the ethics involved in artifacts and archaeology in general. This is a really interesting discussion, and you should get to critically think about how this field is very wide-reaching in terms of how people deal with, or rather deal in, the ancient past. So one thing to keep in mind with this discussion in comparison to week 1 and week 2's discussion is that part 0 and part 1, which are your own individual submissions, those will be due on Friday of this week instead of Sunday. So this pushes the due date for part 1 of the discussion to Friday night at midnight. Why I did this was because there have been too many people waiting until the last day of the week, Sunday, the last day that you can submit your part 1 to the discussion. And this ends up making things much more hectic and nearly impossible for whoever takes on the responsibility of being the reporter for your group summary, which is part 2 of this discussion, of each discussion assignment. So in order to make things go more smoothly, hopefully, and succinctly, one thing after another, this will generate a sequence so that the group summary part 2 of these discussion assignments are given 2 days to be completed by the reporter. And again, the reporter is somebody who takes on the responsibility each week. It's not the same person from the group. It switches, but the group needs to establish this through their own discussions. The point of this assignment is to talk to the people in your group, not just read what they're writing, but actually have a discussion with them. About the topic, about who's going to be taking on the reporter responsibility, these sorts of things. And then the other assignment that we have is our first quiz, quiz number 1. This is really mostly just covering chapter 3 material on early human technology, specifically the lithic technologies. So it's worth reviewing last week's reading and work and prep for the quiz. Besides that, that's all we have this week. It's kind of a short week in terms of assignments. The quiz will be graded automatically. The discussion will be graded after the fact. I will get to that the following week. Okay, so enjoy your reading of chapter 4 this week, and I'll see you next week. Thanks.